Welcome to the Oral History Podcast, which features stories from the oral history website voicesofoklahoma.com, where Oklahomans have given generously of their time to tell their life story for present-day listeners and for the generations to come. Our entire collection is available at voicesofoklahoma.com. By subscribing to our podcast, you will be notified of new Oklahoma oral history podcasts. So now listen to another interesting storyteller from voicesofoklahoma.com.
James Osby Goodwin was one of 8 siblings who grew up next door to Tulsa's St. Monica Catholic Church. His father purchased a 150-acre farm in the community of Alsuma at East 51st Street and South Mingo Road. Nearby railroad tracks separated whites and blacks. At 9 years old, Goodwin became an amputee when he lost his right arm in a horseback riding accident that involved a train on the Katy Railroad. Jim Goodwin is a graduate of the University of Notre Dame and the University of Tulsa College of Law. As a lawyer, he successfully argued before the U.S. Supreme Court and Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals for the constitutionality of local statutes regarding freedom of speech, and he was co-counsel in the matter of reparation for the victims of the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Jim is the publisher of the Oklahoma Eagle, Oklahoma's longest-running black-owned newspaper. The paper is a successor to the Tulsa Star newspaper, which was burned down in the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. Listen to Jim tell his story on the Oral History website, voicesofoklahoma.com.
My name is John Erling, and today's date is March 29, 2012. Jim, state your full name, your date of birth, and your present age.
James O. Goodwin, November the 4th, 1939. I am now 72.
The O, what's the O?
Osby, O-S-B-Y, my mother's maiden name.
We're recording this here in our recording offices of voicesofoklahoma.com. Where were you born?
I was born here in Tulsa at the Moden Hospital, which no longer exists, but now known as a Morton Health Clinic and not a hospital. Dr. Bird was my doctor, as I recall.
Were you one of several children?
One of 8. My oldest sibling died in childbirth, and then my mother had 5 girls and 3 boys thereafter. Actually, so we'd be a sibling of 9. One died in childbirth.
Let's go back to your remembrances of your grandfather. You do have remembrances of him?
Quite well.
What is his name, please?
J.H. or James Henry Goodwin. He came from Mississippi, Water Valley particularly, was married to Carly Goodwin, and left Mississippi, I suspect in the mid-1900s or thereabouts, after statehood, I believe. I don't remember the year of his birth, but he left Water Valley, Mississippi because of the racism that was pernicious during that period of time. He told me that when he would walk down the street, and he could do so with impunity, African Americans who were walking on the same sidewalk, if a white person was walking that same sidewalk, would be waylaid, be taken to an alley and beaten. He's seen that happen more than once. His father was Jewish. I don't know what his father did at the time, and his mother was African American. She may have been one of his servants, I don't know. But because he had 4 children, he did not want that experience, so he left there, bringing them to Oklahoma. He was en route to Waterloo, Iowa, that being the place where the Underground Railroad, if not originated, was a point. He stops in Tulsa, and he becomes very successful in Tulsa, educates his 4 children, sending them to college, and became a landowner. And also one of the ways of making money, aside from rental properties, was that he loaned money for which he got interest.
This is all about James.
James J.H., yes.
All right. Did he go to school here?
No, he did not. He had a 3rd-grade education. He was a grown man when he came to Oklahoma, bringing his family, his wife, and 4 children with him.
Your grandfather, J.H. Goodwin.
Known as Papa.
Tell us more about him, his personality and all.
He was a no-nonsense grandpa. Some of the things I remember about, as I said, he was successful. He built a huge home when it was not really fashionable. And I presume, based upon the standard of living, he was upper middle class. In days of segregation, he was able to educate his children. After the riot burned down Mount Zion, he gave $500 to rebuild it. A copy of that check we still have in our family. So he was a rather successful entrepreneur, for lack of a better term, in which he made money by lending it to others and also by property holdings that he would acquire. I remember as a young man, I would drive him from time to time from place to place. After a certain period of time, he lived with us at 51st and Mingo. My dad had purchased a home there, and my grandpa was a part of our family. He would always tell me, Jim, be a good boy. Although I must remember he was something of a disciplinarian, because before we moved to the country at that time, I remember doing something at home, and my father, having, I guess, such a large family, was able to bring home eggs in huge cartons, wooden cartons. And I remember this crate. I'd done something that did not please my grandpa, and I remember him putting my head between his legs and spanking me with this crate. Certainly, he had the free rein to discipline me. However, I do remember my grandpa telling me that my father, when he was younger, had taken money from my grandpa without his permission and went to Philadelphia. I guess at the age my father was a young man, pre-college. My grandpa said that he said, look, I don't care what you do with your life, just don't take my money. My grandpa was, I guess, a recognized individual within the community, particularly the black community, but he could also pass for white. Don Ross, former legislator, tells the story, which I don't believe, but he swears it's a true story. During the riot, when the rioters were heading toward our home here in Tulsa at the time, we lived on a hill, and my grandpa had built two homes. He had built a huge home for himself, and my father had built one right next door. We lived right across from a Catholic convent, at that time St. Monica's, and the Catholic school also had its school buildings right across the yard. But at the riot, when the rioters were heading in that direction, there were probably 50 stairs that had to go down to descend to the street. My grandpa, Don Ross says, goes down those 50 stairs as the crowd is going in its direction up Haskell Street, by the way, points west and says to the rioters, they went that way. However, my aunt, my father's sister, Anna Carroll, who served in the military and was a social worker, says that the only thing she had left remaining was a dress during the riot, and she was, I think, a young woman at the time. For some reason, we did not escape the riot in terms of personal possessions being destroyed, according to my aunt. That's why I think I would trust my aunt's word as opposed to Mr. Ross. Mm-hmm. Not that I'm saying that he's fibbing, but it certainly makes a good story.
Right. So both your father and your grandfather experienced the 1921 race riot?
Yes, and his three siblings, very much so. This was in 1921. Incidentally, it was the beginning of the newspaper, which my dad bought thereafter. That's when it began. It was the predecessor of the Tulsa Star that was, I'm told, burned to the ground during the riot. The Oklahoma Eagle was then initiated, and my father purchased it back in the mid-30s.
The houses your father and grandfather lived in, were they burned to the ground?
I have no independent recollection. The reason I say that, I know that a block away, the houses were stately homes. Some of them were burned. They were brick. They were burned severely. There's some pictures that yet remain. I have no independent recollection, my brother may, of whether our homes were burned down to the ground or not. One of the homes may have been built after 1921, the one that was the smaller home. I have a picture of the home that I grew up in before we moved to 51st and Mingo, and I have no independent recollection except recalling of my aunt saying that she only had one garment remaining. So I can't tell you that with any certainty.
When you became of age, did you hear them talk about the race riot a lot? And did they tell you stories about it?
Only that it existed, no. I lived at that time on Haskell. At that time, the boundaries within the African-American community, we were bounded on the south by Archer, we were bounded on the west by Cincinnati, and bounded on the east at that time, I think perhaps by Peoria, and then bounded on the north by Pine, as I recall, sort of a 1 mile square area, roughly. We were aware of the riot, yes, and I have an independent recollection of having seen the newspaper that was published by the
Tribune, right,
with inflammatory headlines. In fact, I personally saw the copy that my father had. The publishers of that particular edition assiduously sought to collect them all, at least I'm told. so that there would be no evidence that such a publication existed.
Well, they had two. There was the headline, "Nab Negro for Attacking Girl in an Elevator," and then the editorial titled, "To Lynch Negro Tonight," was said to have reported that whites assembling that evening to lynch the teenage Roland. You remember seeing that editorial?
I remember seeing a headline on the front page of the paper. I do not remember the editorial itself, but I do remember that being a headline I personally saw. And I don't remember if it was the World or the Tribune.
It was the Tribune.
Okay.
That editorial that we're talking about apparently was removed from the Tribune's archives, as well as the Oklahoma edition of the Tribune and the state archives. They say no known copies of the editorial exist today. There are those wondering, you would have thought that at least one paper would have survived all that.
Well, my dad had a copy of it. Of course, I did not at the time know the significance of it, and I was an adult when I saw it. I was fresh out of law school.
We can come back to the race ride again, but let's talk in a little more detail then about your father and mother. Your father's full name?
Edward Lawrence Goodwin.
Your father, Edward, or Ed?
Yes.
He was born where?
He was born in Mississippi.
And then he came here from Water Valley, Mississippi,
and
with his family.
And his other three siblings.
He went to school here then?
He went to school here. In fact, there's a yearbook, I believe, where he is the most likely to succeed, as they do in yearbooks. That was the inscription on his picture, I'm told.
Where did he go to high school?
At Booker T. Washington High School.
He graduated from Booker T.
As did my aunt.
And then he went on to further schooling.
At Fisk University, as did my aunt. My other uncle and aunt, I don't know much about them, but they likewise, I'm sure, had some educations.
What was his degree in?
Business administration.
That would have been in what years about?
My father was, I think, born in either 1902, and my mom was 1903, so it would have to have been somewhere around 1916, 17, 18, maybe around the World War I.
So it's remarkable, going way back then.
That's correct.
He was taught by his father that education is the key to all of this.
Yes.
So he went on to get his degree. What did he do after he graduated?
Well, during his college years, I remember him telling me he worked as a porter on a train. He also had worked on a steamboat. After college, my best recollection, he had a shoe store in St. Louis, Missouri. And then he came back here to Tulsa and bought the newspaper, had rental property that he acquired. One of the enterprises he was engaged in was not permitted by law, and it was known as a policy wheel. That's like the lottery today.
Yeah.
At that time, it was outlawed. And within the black community, my father, I'm told, had this lottery system. Some say it was engaged in numbers racket.
Okay.
Perhaps I don't know this, but that may have been a reason that we were upper middle class during all my lifetime. My father had plenty of cash, and he lived large, but also he bought the newspaper. I'm told by my father that he decided not to engage in that enterprise any longer once the federal government made a requirement to have a tax stamp if you were going to engage in gambling. So he stopped. Along the way, though, he became fast friends with Bob Kerr, who was at that time governor. This was in the 40s. Kerr appointed him to be the state administrator at the orphanage and mental institution at Taft. My father owned his own plane to fly back and forth from Tulsa to Taft, Oklahoma. And he administered a huge budget, even while he was also in the newspaper. In fact, I remember my father telling me, and probably today is why I'm still involved in newspaper business, is that this paper you always have to be a source of influence. At the time, I probably did not understand the significance, nor was I that involved in newspaper business. But later, it fell to my lot to take it over. In fact, many times, someone who doesn't know anything about our family wondered how I got into the newspaper business. My younger brother, Bob, who, by the way, his full name is Robert Kerr Goodwin, was at the helm after my father decided to retire. Bob was in theological school in Berkeley in California and came back here to run the newspaper at a young age. Bob decided after 10 years he wanted to do something else. I tell people, if you ever seen that commercial, MASH, the popular sitcom of a few years ago, back I guess in the 70s, there was a commercial advertising it where a horse breaks loose and one of the superior officers wants to know, is anybody there who can ride horses? One of the privates raised his hand and says, well, I stepped in some manure once. He says, you're in charge. So, although I was actually practicing law in 79, that's when I took over the newspaper. But prior to that, my father had the paper, and it was a source of influence. I remember meeting dignitaries when I was a kid. Bob Kerr, Raymond W. Gary, when he was a governor, President Sukarno of Indonesia, Dick Nixon when he ran for the vice presidency in Eisenhower years. I was living in my high school years, last two, in Springfield, Illinois. So I, with a press pass, got in to see these dignitaries. I remember going to the Junior Chamber of Commerce confab, their annual meeting they had in Springfield. Leon Sullivan was a very popular African-American person that they celebrated because of his outstanding work in creating jobs for African-Americans throughout the United States. Anyway, the newspaper did provide a platform, and as it turned out, my staying in it, not to make money, but to provide a voice, since the newspaper's origin was dealing with the underdog. I mean, that's the origin of newspapers generally. I found it an opportune time for me to use the paper to speak out on issues that were otherwise sometimes not popular, sometimes not favored, but always adhering to what my mother and father tried to embed in us, and that is standing up for, people who are not otherwise fortunate.
He was known for his editorials. Ed was your father.
He was.
And I believe was also known for promoting education for blacks.
That's correct.
I got a quote here. He once told a reporter that knowing how to manage money is more important than receiving a flood of federal dollars.
That sounds like my dad. My dad was a sharp, shrewd businessman. He went to law school when he was in his early 50s, maybe about 54 years old. My mom, years later, said he expressly went to make a place for me. The study of law is a jealous mistress. And at that age, to even think about going to law school. But I might say that one of the other things that he saw was that he paid a huge fee to a lawyer out of Muskogee, $150,000 fee in the mid-50s. He said later, if they make this kind of money, I'm going to go to law school. So he saw that as a revenue enhancement profession. He studied night school. This was just on the beginning of Brown versus Board of Education when he went to law school. I remember my father studying at night.
At Tulsa University?
At Tulsa University.
That was in 1954.
Well, the Brown versus Board of Education was in 54.
It was handed down on May 17th, 1954.
And he probably went into law school, began, I'm going to say, in 55 or 56 at the latest. For 4 years, he went to night school.
Wow. Yeah, that's remarkable.
And then practiced for about 15 plus years after that.
He was inducted into the Oklahoma Journalism Hall of Fame, the Tulsa Historical Society Hall of Fame. So we got to come to your mother. Your mother's name?
Jeannie B. Goodwin. Her middle name stood for Bell. Her maiden name was Osby, O-S-B White. In fact, my mother tells me that her mother and father disapproved of my father as an appropriate suitor for her. In fact, my mother tells me that the way she got married was by eloping. But she eloped on a unilateral move on the part of my father, that she was taken by surprise, and he said, I'm going to marry you, and they, in fact, got married. Years later, I asked my mom if she regretted it, and she said no, she never did regret the decision, and he treated her like a queen, really, as a kid growing up. My mother had long, flowing hair, and she, too, could pass for white. Now, in fact, when he would go to Mississippi, she would have to ride in the back seat of the vehicle, people thinking that he was her chauffeur. They didn't go to Mississippi that often. But she, like my grandpa, was very fair complected.
Was she a homemaker then and took care of the home?
Yeah, she was a homemaker. She began her work in social work, then became a teacher. After the 8 kids were of age, she went back to teaching. My brother Bob, when Bob was born, she was about 45 years old, so she went back to teaching somewhere in her mid-40s and early 50s and taught until she retired in her 60s. My mother, who originated from Springfield, Illinois, interesting enough, Fadi was, I think, a nickname for my grandfather on her side, and Minnie was her mother. I have in my possession a clock, reportedly, that came out of the office of Abe Lincoln when he was a lawyer, because I think my grandpa did some janitorial. He was in real estate business, but also part of his life he did janitorial work. And reportedly, according to my mother, this clock came from his office. when he was in partnership with another lawyer whose name was Casey. I do have in my office also an original paper, the Illinois paper, where Abe Lincoln and his partner are advertising their profession on the front page, classified ad. Anyway, my mom graduated from Springfield. There was a race ride in Springfield, Illinois, I believe, when she was living there. So she had experienced 2 race rides in her lifetime. I guess my first principles of life came from my mom. From a young age, I can always remember her telling me, not that I understood the significance, but she would always quote to me, "For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul?" Now, I was taught that passage as a child. I know not why it would resonate with me. Those were one of the first principles that I received from her. Another principle was, when you're facing adversity, or when people are dead set to cause you grief, for whatever reason, you don't get bitter, you get better. Those are 2 principles of living that she always embedded in us as children growing up. By contrast, my father, one of the principles embedded in me by him was, a man who does not take care of his family is worse than an infidel. That was etched in my mind. Typical, I suppose, of an American family, even though you had all these other kinds of negatives going on in our society, those principles and community service, I was sort of born into. My father raised 8 children plus. He was always providing. He was a builder. He was a man who loved gardening, and he loved hunting, and he was always building edifices, for this, that, and the other. My mom was an excellent homemaker, loving. I can remember her and my aunt telling me stories. They'd tell me stories of Brer Rabbit. My aunt, Anna Carroll, was a great storyteller, and I would crawl in her lap. Mother, on occasion, would do the same thing. Mother would always tell each of us, but privately, I learned later, "You're my favorite." And I later learned what she meant was that we all were her favorites, right? And I inferred that what she meant by that was, like, there are different sized glasses, if you will, and each one is filled to the brim. So we all had enough love. She'd pour enough love into us to fill us up, so to speak. And so to the extent that we were individuals, she would pour her love sufficient into each one of us, which made us all feel special. That was my mom. My mom was a very God-fearing woman, as you can tell. When we were young, the nuns would come over. My mother was somewhat sickly. I remember on one of the plateaus where we lived, she had a lounge chair with a padding, and she would sit out kind of in the sun, just resting, because she was a weak person. This long flowing hair, I remember very much. And the nuns would come over and take my brother, Edward, who was about 4 years my senior, and I into tow, and take us over to the school. So I was learning to form letters in preschool. My brother, Edward, was an altar boy later. And then years later, I returned to the Catholic Church. I was baptized. She allowed us to be baptized. Her view was, there are many roads that lead to Rome. As long as you're in the church, I don't care what church it's in. Just be there. Never was she fixed on any particular, quote, faith. So as a result, from the Catholic Church, I was introduced to the Methodist Church, to the Baptist Church. And then years later, in my high school formative years, when I began to search for that which fed me, I returned to the Catholic Church. But Mother was always supportive and always sort of monitored our progress by never intruding into our lives, but always dropping a hint here or there or making a comment here or there.
But as a youth, were you raised in the Catholic Church, so the whole family went to the Catholic Church?
No, I was not. Sister who was a Methodist, attended a Lutheran church. I had some who were Baptists. So, no, there was a hodgepodge, if you will, for lack of a better term. All Mother wanted to know was God's first and you serve Him.
So she hadn't chosen this particular church herself?
No, she would go Baptist. In fact, when we moved to the country, we went to a one-room church that was by the track. In fact, my dad's funeral was there when Oral Roberts insisted on coming to be part of the ceremony. We had just a one-room church. We probably could seat no more than 30 people.
And where was this located?
In Alsuma. Just a few feet away from the track that I lost my arm on, the Katy Railroad, there was a church right by the railroad track in Alsuma.
Alsuma?
Yeah, Alsuma was a little community that was just outside of Tulsa. That is now at 51st Domingo and that area. It encompassed probably a square mile, maybe, or maybe it was only about 320 acre in size. The Oakland Greenhouse was there at the time, the Peters. There was a schoolhouse that I went to school at. It was a 2-room schoolhouse. And there was a black and white community separated by the tracks. It was called Alsuma. The Paramons, the Indian tribe Paramon, that branch lived right down the street from us. It was called Alsuma.
So that was way out in the country then, as far as Tulsa was concerned.
Right. From my dad's office to our home place was about 15 miles, which was a long way in the 30s and 40s.
You said when your father died, you had the funeral there.
At that church. By that time, he and Oral Roberts were very close. My dad had been a trustee at Oral Roberts' bank, and my brother Bob finished at ORU and was a very active student in Oral Roberts' ministry, traveled over the world with him and his World Action Singers, and later was president of the student body. This would be, I think, the second graduating class at ORU. My dad and Oral Roberts and Evelyn Roberts were very close. This would have been in the 70s. I remember when my dad was in a nursing home, both those people coming to see him and speaking with him.
The first education was in that one-room schoolhouse for you.
Well, no, because we moved from Tulsa, the site now of OSU. On the hillside, there's an apartment complex. And on that hill was where our home was, in the convent. It's now changed in character. And I was there from my kindergarten years to my 3rd grade. And then my 4th, 5th, and 6th grades were at this one-room schoolhouse.
In Alsuma.
In Alsuma.
Then you attended beyond that school.
I left there and went to Carver. We were bused. I would take the bus on occasion, or ride with my dad, to Carver Junior High School. Then from there I went to Washington. I spent 1 year at Booker T. Washington, and I wanted to leave there because I didn't think I was getting the same quality of education as my white counterparts. By this time, I was associated with a summer group of kids, integrated group, and we discussed books and public affairs. Central, Webster, and Booker T. Washington were the only 3 schools at that time in the city. Well, Rogers may have existed as well. And those kids from Central seemed to be much brighter than I was. And yet I was making A's. I was an honor student. But they just seemed to know more. In fact, I remember I had an English teacher, and one of our assignments was to commit to memory Thanatopsis. And I was able to do that. She gave me an A. I thought that was an adequate, my own assessment. So I asked my mother if I could go elsewhere. So my aunt, her sister, who at that time had been an administrative aide to Adlai Stevenson when he was running for the presidency, opened her doors, and my aunt lived with her mother. So they let me come there, and I entered into a Catholic high school, preparatory school there in Springfield. That's when I got reconnected with the Catholic faith.
That first year at Booker T, what year was that you were in school?
That would have been just the year before the Supreme Court side, would have been 54, 55. I think 54, 55.
Let's go back also to your early years, because you referred to the accident which took your arm.
Right.
Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. Generally, when people ask about it, if it's a young kid, my lead-in is I disobeyed my parents, which of course leads to a puzzlement. But as I told you, we lived on a 160-acre farm with cows and horses and geese and guineas and ducks. My dad, on that 160 acres, he farmed 80 of it on occasion for wheat and corn. And he had his own garden in our yard as well. We had 3 ponds on the place. Anyway, one day, a playmate of mine who lived in Alsuma came up to my home around 5 o'clock in the evening with his own horse. You can't imagine how excited I was that my friend would have a horse. He came up, and he had contrived this bridle out of rope and baling wire with no cup chain. When he steals away, and of course, this is dinner time, I'm excited. So I saddle up my horse, which was a Tennessee walking horse at the time, and we steal out of the yard while everybody else is at the dinner table. And I just half a mile away, we're down into the village of Alsuma. Both of the horses were racing one another. And I couldn't stop the horse I was riding because it didn't have the proper gear.
How old are you now?
Approaching 9 years old. I'm within 2 or 3 months of being 9. And the train's coming, Katy Railroad. Well, there was a little side stop, maybe a couple of blocks away. And so it was not speeding. It had just stopped and was pulling off, maybe going 20 miles an hour, possibly. I have no independent recollection. I'm surmising that. Not knowing the laws of physics, I'm jumping off because I'm coming head on. I'm thinking I'm going to hit the train with the horse. I jump off. Well, rather than falling backwards, I'm propelled with the speed of the horse. My head hits the railing of the track. I'm out like a light. I do remember my descent from the horse jumping off, and my head hit the track, but rather than being perpendicular to the track, I fall in the center of the track between the two rails. And the train runs over me. I'm told it had a hook underneath that swung back and forth. And I remember I had this T-shirt with white and red stripes that were lateral. The hook took the shirt, I guess it was loose enough, and caught a hold of it and dragged me 50, 60, 70, 80 feet before the train came to a stop. I'm, of course, out like a light at this point in time. I'm told the engineers had given me up because blood is gushing everywhere. Two men come by, one whose dad was an insurance salesman, knocked door to door selling penny policies, and there had to be some other person I had learned. They pulled me from under the track, apply a tourniquet to me. The sheriff's office comes and picks me up, and I remember distinctly my mother. Here I'm out like a light, but my memory now serves me many years later. I remember being in her lap, with my head on her lap, and I remember her praying. I don't know if she was shedding tears, but I do remember vaguely, like you're in a daze. My head is the size of a football at the time. I later learned that I'm delivered to one of the hospitals, either Hillcrest or St. John's, I don't know which, and I was refused admittance. They then took me to Mercy Hospital, which was owned by Dr. Sisler. That's where I was able to be treated. I do remember that story, but my mother, they never made a big point of it, nor was there any litigation ever about me and the train, because my father felt I was at fault, of course. My older brother's recollection of the event was he was just about to put a piece of pie in his mouth, and someone comes in and says, Jimmy has been hit by a train, or words to that effect. His reaction was, I don't think he used the D word, but something like that came out of his mouth. And it was not regretting the fact that I had an accident, but it was regretting the fact that he could not finish his pie. He tells me. But I do remember my mother running down there a quarter of a mile barefooted. I do remember that story being told me.
This is in the
1948, 49.
And we point that out because it was because of your race that you were rejected at that hospital.
Correct.
Your life could have been lost because of that. They didn't know that when they turned you away.
Right. I know. I woke up maybe 2 or 3 weeks later. I was in a coma. I say a coma. I was not aware of what was going on for many days. My classmates sent me a big box of plastic toys. There was a hamburger stand not far from my dad's office. They would bring me the hamburgers, which I loved. I just relished the idea of being treated. In fact, I told my dad, if I didn't get a pound in a pony, I might die of him. At that time, Roy Rogers was my idol. My father had us working, my brother and I working. I must be 6 years old, cleaning the presses, the metal on the presses that the rubber rolls would rub against and the paper would go through. I had to be 6 years old, and my grandpa was also a taskmaster. By this time, my dad owned the paper and the press and all the stuff that went with it. And I remember having to sweep up these metal shavings that would be a part of the metal letters that would be printed out that then were put in for the printing of the paper. And the ink around the linotype machines seems like it was forever to clean those. They had to be almost swept clean and not a trace of anything. I remember that being an arduous task for me, but the most exasperating task was cleaning those metal rollers. They had to be spit clean, but I would use gasoline, as I recall, or kerosene to rub the ink off those metal rollers. The more I wiped, the more smears would come back and forth, back and forth. I mean, even to the point of tears, and my grandpa would come by. You didn't do it. Come over here, son, and get this. Well, that activity would probably take 2 hours, 2.5 hours on Saturday morning, for which I earned the grand total of 30 cents. 20 cents for the movies and 10 cents for popcorn. That was an assignment of mine at that young age. And right down the street, this is in the Black Wall Street, was the Dreamland Theater. My friend and I would go in and enjoy an afternoon on Saturday with popcorn in hand. Roy Rogers. So I grew up wanting Palomino ponies, and for today I still have that. Anyway, that was the work ethic that both my grandpa and my father instilled in me.
Here you were above middle class means. You had money.
Right.
But do you remember going downtown Tulsa?
Yes. First of all, I really did not understand the full effects of segregation until I was about 13 years old and living out in the country. You could get everything you needed within the black community at that time, except I don't know whether I know these stories as experiencing them and understanding them at the time or whether or not my mother shared them later. But my mother, who was very fair, which could pass for white, as did my grandfather, I remember going into Brown Duncan's store, Brown Duncan's or Vander's, I can't remember which.
And what was Brown Duncan?
It was a store where you bought clothes.
Department store?
Department store. But I don't know what a library.
You're not sure which store it was?
Yeah. But my mother wanted to try on a hat. When they saw these children, they would not allow her to try a hat on. And my mother could have gone in without us, but she would not do that. When I applied to go to Notre Dame University at the suggestion of my aunt, Leo, who was the administrative assistant, Natalie Stevenson, my mother took all my grades and certificates of recognition to the back door of Joe LaFortune's house. Joe LaFortune was a big man at Notre Dame, having received an education there. Because he got a free education, he was very generous years later to that university. Mother never said that she was required to come to the back door, but she apparently knew one of the servants of LaFortune. So I'm not suggesting or implying that this was required of her to be relegated to the back door. I just remember she said that's where she went. Then, of course, got an audience with LaFortune, and he gave me a letter of recommendation to Notre Dame, for which I'm grateful.
He was the father, of course, of Bob LaFortune, who was the mayor of our city. And then wasn't turnaround again, because didn't you then write a letter of recommendation?
Yes, I did. Interestingly enough, the former mayor,
Bill LaFortune's daughter, wanted to go to Notre Dame. And he asked me if I would write a letter of recommendation, to which, of course, unqualifiedly would I do so, and we felt privileged to be able to do so. Your experience at Notre Dame, that was a good experience for you?
Wonderful experience. Because of my years of what I thought was not adequate in my secondary school years, I never felt as informed or educated as I saw my white counterparts at Central were. One of the areas I was weak in was English, I thought, and composition, writing. But I get admitted to Notre Dame. I'm able to get the requisite entry, but I still had a thirst for writing better. So I get to Notre Dame, and I do a lot of improvement there. Shortly thereafter, there were probably 5,000 students at Notre Dame at the time, not much larger than today even. And I thought there were about 10 African Americans there at the time. This would have been 1957, but I since have been told by Ron Gregory, the brother of Dick Gregory, who was a year ahead of me then. There may have been as many as 20 of us, I don't recall. And perhaps 10, maybe 15 may have been graduate students, and probably only 5 of us undergraduate students at the time.
Did you feel accepted there? Was there
there was, I'd come
prejudice?
Well, if it was oblivious, because keep in mind, I was sheltered in my childhood up until 13, and I'll tell you about that story, but no, I never. And then, of course, I was in an integrated situation there in Springfield, Illinois. So I never felt the stigma of being black. That never was a preoccupation of mine. I did have it occur to me traveling through Missouri once as a college student. And I had it happen to me in Tulsa when I was younger, when I was told to get to the back of the bus. At that time, the transportation into Tulsa from 51st and Mingo, one of the buses that go interstate would come by and stop and pick up people to take them on into Tulsa. And I remember having to come into Tulsa to my dad's place. I got on this bus. I sat in the center. There was an older black couple in the back. And I sat sort of center. And this lady, I may be 2 miles down the road, I see her lean forward close enough to the driver. And then the driver says something to the effect, "Get to the back of the bus." I think I knew at that time what he meant, so I was aware of the custom. But I pretended I didn't hear. So he said, "Get to the back of the bus." To this day, I regret this. I acceded to his request rather than demanding I get off. But by that time, I was probably maybe 13 miles away from Tulsa. I didn't have the intestinal fortitude to say, "Let me off this bus." Because by that time, my dad could have bought the bus,
So is that the incident at 13 that you're talking about?
I was about 13 years old. And the second time that happened was I rode my horse up to 51st and Memorial, right across from the Memorial Park Cemetery, right about a half block south of Memorial. There was a little sideway hamburger place. So I rode my horse up, got off of it, and went in to order a hamburger, and they bagged it for me. I said, no, I'll eat it here. I think I walked out on that occasion without taking the hamburger, but those are the only two instances in Oklahoma. Later, when I was in Missouri, in between trains to come back to Tulsa or to go to South Bend, I'm decked out in a tweed suit with one of the style hats, and a vest. I mean, I'm dressed to the T, my shoes are shined, you know. I'm famished. We get into St. Louis in the wee hours of the morning. I'm famished. Everything's closed. And at that time, the train station, everything was closed down where you could eat there with impunity. When I walked out a few blocks from the train station, I found this hamburger place. It was Horseshoe. I went in. Only one person was in there, and that was the cook. I ordered this hamburger and a drink. I'm sitting there by myself, and he puts in the sack. I said, no, I'll eat it here. It's about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. And so I'm sorry, I can't. My boss won't let me. I said, what do you mean? I don't see anybody here. I can't. I'm famished. So I take the hamburger and leave the drink. And I eat it outside. And I then walk across the street to deposit the debris into a trash can rather than throwing it on the sidewalk, which I thought was the appropriate thing to do. Well, I'm still thirsty. So I walk another block into a smaller establishment. When I walk in, there's a cop and a couple of patrons, and the waitress, I order a drink. Well, at that point, she said they'll cap it. I said, no, that's all right. I will drink it. No, you can't. So I just leave the drink and walk on back to the station. Those are the only instances that I have experienced racism.
How old were you then?
I was in college. I was a sophomore probably at Notre Dame.
Did this anger you? Was it something that you thought, we need to correct this? Or were you passive about it and just decided, I need to live my life and not worry about that?
I was certainly angry about it, but not to the extent that I harbored any kind of ill will. It's just like you're rebuffed or slighted, and you just go on about your business. You don't dwell on it. That's dwelling on a negative. You don't get bitter, you get better. So it was just like you get knocked down or you get tackled, you get up and you go on. You don't preoccupy yourself with that.
Yeah.
The only time that I exercised racism or felt like it was on the day that Jack Kennedy was assassinated. At that time, I was in law school, and I was working for Raymond David Graham, a district judge, as a minute clerk, without knowing any facts surrounding Kennedy's assassination. I was leaving a lecture at the law school. I was in night school. But on this occasion, there was some activity in the daytime during the lunch hour, some speaker, I don't have any independent recollection of who. When I got into my car to go back to the courthouse, it came across that Jack Kennedy was assassinated. That hit me like a death nail into my heart. And immediately, without knowing, I assumed somebody white did it. And when I hit that courthouse door, I refused to look anybody white. Keep in mind that my boss is white. And I never felt any kind of ill will ever. Mm-hmm. But I had a disdain and I guess a hatred for what I thought to be somebody white killing a good man. Mm-hmm. Why the good die young kind of thing. Because Jack Kennedy epitomized all what I thought was good about life, in a sense. He was successful, he was handsome, he was articulate. He inspired me and many others. At Notre Dame, they would have mock presidential elections. And I remember how involved people were. But Jack Kennedy inspired a younger generation, my generation particularly. That lasted, though, that hate, if you will, lasted probably not more than 2.5 hours. And then it dissipated, particularly since I spent the weekend watching the news coverage and even witnessed, as many Americans did, the assassination of Kennedy's assassin.
Let me just take you back, because you'll have a comment on this, on sports. I just happened to be reading a book on Willie Mays. They referred to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The scholar Charles Ogletree pointed out in all deliberate speed that Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King had very different approaches to ending segregation. Marshall believed in change through the court system. King advocated nonviolent political protest or extra-legal challenges. First of all, did you have any interaction with Martin Luther King at any time?
I did. I believe I may have been a sophomore at Notre Dame. Now, keep in mind the backdrop here. This was the height of the Civil Rights Movement. I think King began to make his campaign actively, maybe 58, 59, possibly. When he sort of came to the forefront, he was invited to speak here in Tulsa at the First Baptist Church in Tulsa North. My father's office was right across the street from that church, which was abutting Carver Junior High School, where it was presently located. When he was invited, I was asked to introduce Reverend Ben Hill, who in his own right was quite a man and quite a preacher and quite an inspired speaker. I was invited to introduce him. He, in turn, would introduce Dr. King. So as a result, I had the privilege of sitting on the dais in the church.
And that year would have been?
I'm going to guess it had to be 58, 59, I think.
So you got to be there on the same stage. Do you remember the words of Martin Luther King then?
Well, only the same as, I won't say typical, but was of his style as it was when he spoke in Memphis. I mean, these were speeches that were uplifting and telling us, that there is a way and that America has to come to grips with its own self on this issue. Inspiring. And as I said, my privilege was to introduce Ben Hill. But Ben Hill was the editor of the Oklahoma Eagle at the time, in addition to being the minister at the Boren A&M Church. Of course, Ben Hill later became a state legislator in his retirement years. At that time, accompanying Dr. King was his right-hand man,
Ralph Abernathy?
Abernathy. And they both came over to my father's office. And I'm sitting in my father's desk in his main office. And on the other side of the desk, Reverend Abernathy and Dr. King. I know Reverend Abernathy, and I'm engaged in conversation. Now, here's a kid, a little college kid, whose claim to fame, perhaps from outside, was the fact I was a Notre Damer, which was a rarity. As I indicated to you, there were maybe 5 of us at the time in undergraduate school. The others may have been graduate students. I don't have an independent recollection, but I think we may have been one of us in each class. Let's see, there were 2 of us. Dr. Pierre was my roommate. And I think we were the only 2. Dick Gregory's brother, Rod, who at that time was the star of the Gregory family because he was a distance runner, track, and was on a scholarship there. Dr. Pierre was on a scholarship. My daddy paid my way there. In stark contrast, I think back then the 4 years at Notre Dame was about 10 grand. Now it's about 40 grand per year, if not more. I've had the privilege of sending one of my children there.
Let's bring you back then to these 2 gentlemen.
Yes, of course, again, my education, Dr. King would have been about a decade ahead of me. If he were living, he was in his 80s now, I think. What was interesting in my reading, and I don't know whether I was aware at the time, but my education was of the same, I thought, stellar quality as was his. Many of the things that he would reference in his speeches, I was acquainted with and understood. But perhaps he spoke a universal language that appealed both to those who were lettered and those who weren't. Dr. King was an inspiring man, no question about it. Just an aside, on his death, I did not react to his death as I did with John Kennedy. I did react to his death. Don Ross and I were in my office the night of his death, commiserating. And it came out of my mouth talking to Don. At that time, Kennedy was killed, King was killed. I said to Don, I wonder where the 3rd K is going to come from that will forever be the KKK. And of course, thereafter, his brother died. So to me, it symbolized in my mind there are 3 Ks that were going to nullify the evilness of the KKK. That was just an aside, but I do remember talking to Don Ross about that. Don was so upset that he had confided to me that he had done a dastardly thing in protest. We then flew, my dad, myself, I think Amos Hall, who was a jurist here, who had done work with Thurgood Marshall in the early U.S. Supreme Court cases. McLaren was one of the cases, I think. There were 2 others. Anyway, we all go to the funeral. I mean, I felt committed to go to that funeral. In the later years, interesting enough, my nephew, my brother Edward's son, was Corrado Scott King administrative assistant. He later died in an automobile fatality. But Dr. King, I remember it, and I remembered what hope he gave us, if you will. Now, you have to keep in mind, I'm not stigmatized by the evils of race as some of my other colleagues were, and my peers were. I didn't have to suffer those kind of things. And if I did, we were taught, you don't get bitter, you get better, and You had to be better than if you're going to succeed.
Did you ever join any of Martin Luther King's marches?
The only march I ever joined in Dr. King was his funeral.
Okay.
His funeral. I represented people, but never involved in demonstrations.
I'm still taken with that scene when you're sitting in the office and Ralph Abernathy and Martin Luther King walk in. What do they say to you?
Well, I have no independent recollection, but I assume they're talking about my own experience as a student. You know, again, I'm oblivious to the moment, the significance of that moment.
Yeah, that's a neat scene. This kind of helps us here as I continue in this from this book on Willie Mays. In Birmingham, Alabama, resistance to Brown versus Board of Education quickly surfaced. Before the decision, the city commissioners had abolished the ordinance that had prohibited blacks and whites from sharing any recreational activity. Mm-hmm. We assumed that whites and blacks could play ball together, and that was not the case.
Right.
The commission unanimously amended the laws so blacks and whites could play spectator sports together, including baseball, which would have more easily allowed Willie Mays to play exhibitions in his hometown. But 2 weeks after Brown, Birmingham voters resegregated baseball, among other sports, by a margin of 3-1. That's just hard to believe.
Yeah. At that time, I remember reading the Tulsa World and the Tulsa Tribune. You remember a journalist by the name of D.H. Lawrence?
Yes.
Lawrence was a rabid, I think, segregationist, but also was H.L. Mencken, whom I love. I mean, the guy was beautiful, but the line there was, you know, race mixing. There was a prohibition about that. Misogynist relationships were not permitted. But keep in mind now, I'm coming out of a background where my mother looks like she's white, my grandpa looks like he's white. We have Jewish blood in us, we have Irish blood in us, we have black blood, we have Indian blood.
And you have wealth.
And wealth.
Some wealth.
Some wealth, yes. So I'm immunized from some of these kinds of things. And yet, when I would play with my playmates who were not as fortunate, I begged my father to let me go work in a country club setting or a club setting that was exclusively white or Jewish, as the case may be. I begged for that opportunity because my little playmates would tell me their stories about how rich people lived and how this happened and that happened and their successes. And I felt I was missing out on life. So I begged.
You wanted to be a servant.
As a result, my father got me a job with the husband of my health teacher at Carver, Mr. Carter, who was in charge of the locker room at Meadowbrook Country Club. So I went there. I cleaned golf shoes. I shined golf shoes. I cleaned latrines. I picked up towels. I swept the floor. I went and got food for the patrons into the locker room and drove to work in a two-seater Thunderbird. So my peers did not have one over me. I could hopefully share the same kind of experiences that they would have. So I wasn't left out. My father and my mother both would say, look, no one's better than you are, but you're no better than anyone else. They always kept that moderation, but always trying to excel, doing your best, but never getting beside yourself, ever. Don't take yourself that serious, ever. It seemed to be the hallmark of some of my training.
You graduate from Notre Dame. What was your degree?
In liberal art. They had a special program there at the time that was initiated by a fellow out of Chicago called the Great Books of the Western World. It's called the General Program. And after my traditional classes, my freshman year, I was accepted into this general program that was somewhat elite. Otto Bird at the time headed it up. We would not study textbooks. We dispensed with textbooks and read the works of the people about whom textbooks were written for 3 years. Our class size was probably 15 at the most. We'd sit around tables such as this and talk after being given heavy assignments. Our biology class, Professor Nutting, Willis Nutting, wonderful man. In my days, they were very rich. He would take us out in a wooded area like such as we look at birds and talk about them. Dr. Cronin, my English and lyrics professor, looked like the fellow on the TV sitcom Gilligan's Island. There was a robust fellow with a bald head whose name escapes me. Professor Cronin looked like him. Wonderful man who taught me writing. During the vacation, when I didn't come to Tulsa, he invited me to his home for Thanksgiving along with his family, and it was a wonderful opportunity. I felt very close. I walked the campus with Theodore Hesburgh, whom I still love, and was a wonderful man who had this presence of mind. Father Hesburgh was probably the youngest president of Notre Dame at that time, in his 40s. But he had a great sense about him and presence of mind, always inspiring. I remember him telling me walking the campus about his Southern contingency being still racist, and he was looking for that ideal student who was African American, who was both had brains and brawn, because Notre Dame was a big football place, which I was never that involved in sports. My college roommate, Dr. Pierre, is still a trustee there. He may be emeritus now he's my age. But for 40 years, this guy was brilliant. He was brilliant. He's probably the first African American ever to have a PhD in electrical engineering, which is amazing considering our history. But he has that distinction, Dr. Pierre, who served as Secretary of the Army and served as president of universities and had an engineering chair at Michigan State. A very distinguished individual. I've looked on the net to see his biography. It's amazing what he's done. But that guy was excellent in engineering and also knew what I knew. And Lawrence used to infuriate me because I knew nothing about what he was doing. And he could intelligently have conversations with me about the books I was reading. He even had the gall to stop me if I misused a word. Generally engaged in debate, he was right.
You were celebrated here in Tulsa because you were obviously the first African-American to go to Notre Dame out of Tulsa.
Yes.
And then, I don't know, since you, others have gone?
There have been several since who've gone up there.
When you came home, then, that's why you were able to be on stage. Here's this young, bright, upcoming Notre Dame person.
I'm sure that had to be a factor in it because one of the first, And then considering my father's and our family's status within the community, that had a lot to do with it. Sure. As a matter of fact, I don't want to misjudge, but I think I was something of a popular kid when I was at Carver Junior High School as class president, student body president. And I sometimes thought I got grades, not that I didn't work hard, but when I was given that A in English just for memorizing, it appeared to me Thanatopsis, I felt the fact that I was a good one may have had something to do with him grading me. My father was kind of a no-nonsense person. I think his reputation was, you don't cross that Goodwin kind of attitude. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, in retrospect, I don't know if that had anything to do with it. Because I was always conscientious. My parents would never let me slack off on my assignments.
I'm taken with the fact that you were upset because you believe you got an easy A. How many of us in school would have said, wow, I got an A, let's move on? But
I would have felt cheated because I had something to compare. And these kids that I spent summers with, these kids seem to know so much and have an understanding of what it was that they were doing. But by the same token, I remember I was acting out in a geometry class, Mr. Tate's geometry class, on a winter. The windows were open. At that time, these windows opened laterally. This was Washington High School, and it was shaped like a C, if you would, with two wings on it. And one of the kids in my class, geometry class, early in the morning, before Professor Tate came into the room, had gone around the school building and hit me with a snowball through the window. And, of course, great laughter evoked from the classmates, and, of course, I was somewhat embarrassed by it and upset, too. So I get up to go out to do the same thing, and as I get outside to throw the snowball, Professor Tate walks into the room. Well, needless to say, I'm sent to the dean's office. Dean Ellis, whose son, by the way, later went to MIT, brilliant, genius mentality. I go to the dean's office, and Professor Ellis tells me I shouldn't have done that. I'm on the slide. I insisted he spank me because I could not go back, and honestly, I could not countenance the attitude that might be engendered against me for not being paddled. At that time, you could paddle with impunity. So he gave me my licks, and he meant what he gave me, so I could, with some sort of intellectual integrity, go back and say, yeah, he gave me a licking. Because I did not want to be able to say I got off. I did not want that. The stigma that's attendant to that, and these kids I like and loved,
What did you do after graduation from Notre Dame?
I entered law school, Tulsa University Night School. By this time, I got married. Well, the first semester, I got married in November, Thanksgiving, of the very year I graduated from Notre Dame, and so in love at the time that I didn't really study much. I'd gone to a journalism class in the summer at TU, where I was in college, and it was a breeze. For some reason, I thought I would have that same breeze in law school. Not so. But I kind of got married in November, Thanksgiving of that same year. Then I began to do it myself to my studies.
During the day, you were working at the newspaper?
No, during the day, my dad got me a job with Wes Fry, the district court clerk, and I was the second black appointment in the justice system ever. in the Tulsa County District Court. So I got a job as a minute clerk. And West Fry would hire law students as minute clerks to work for the judges. Judge Tom Cruson, who's now retired, was a minute clerk. Bill Means, who was a retired district judge, was a minute clerk. Peter Bradford, who served with distinction, he's now in Oklahoma City, was a minute clerk. Jay Dalton, who's now deceased, who was a district judge, was a minute clerk. Ed Rogers was a bailiff who was retired. He was down in Tulsa area. I was in that group. J.C. Joyce, who has a firm here with Blackstock and Joyce, used to be years ago, was a minute clerk. So I got the benefit of watching people, both good and bad, in the practice of the law. So by the time I got out of law school, while I may not have known what to do, I sure knew what not to do when it came to procedural aspects of the practice.
You said you were married. Your wife's name?
Vivian Palm. Her dad she was my next door neighbor, as a matter of fact. Her dad purchased my father's home that he had built for my mom before we moved to the home that my grandfather built for us on the hill. And with disdain, I did not like her. She was a good friend of my sister's. And I remember distinctly having gone to the circus and coming back with a baton with glitter on the knob, gold glitter. I was proud of that little thing. And somehow they took possession of it, and I was upset. And I remember as we were walking to, at that time, Charles S. Johnson Elementary School, which had been the former Booker T. Washington High School, intentionally going across the streets, I was so angry with them. And then probably 20 years later, I married her, to which we have 5 children.
Okay, I was going to ask you that you have 5 children from that marriage. Mm-hmm. When do you get connected to the newspaper?
Well, of course, I grew up cleaning the press. But my brother Bob had it for 10 years and decided he wanted to do something else, and had his fill, because in a sense he came back filial obligation, at the request of my father. And he did some significant things. Bob became very close at that time to Boren when he was governor. Bob did some significant things, but he did not go through with the ministry until later. He left there, but he decided that he wanted to do something else. So, again, the admonition of my father saying, keep the paper. It'll always be a source of influence. I then stepped up. Since it's been running me, because I still practice law. But 1979 is when I assumed the role of a publisher of the paper.
As you look back on the paper, your role there, any particular issues that you may have editorialized, written about?
There have been many issues. Those that come to my mind are most recent. It's been about 3 years ago or less. I wrote a stinging editorial after making repeated attempts to catch their attention. And before I go further, I would say that I never wanted to use the paper as a source of personal aggrandizement. For some reason, that didn't appeal to me, to try to use it from that point of view. Never do I like to do that. Doing like my name in it. Every now and then there's something of news that you have to do, you do it. But OU had decided it was going to build a diagnostic clinic within the community. And it did not fill the pulse of the community. They did a survey that said such a facility was needed. And it was sponsored by Kaiser and company. But Dr. Clancy, much to his credit, had headed up this initiative. Keep in mind now, I have been for years on the Health Department Board of Health. I'd been head of the Morton Health Center about 7 years. I'd been involved in the Tulsa Community Action Agency as head of it for about 7 years, on the board, that is. So I was intimately involved in these community affairs, and citizens' participation was part and parcel of these institutions. Well, here comes a diagnostic clinic. Keeping in mind now, the medical community in the North community was fading. It used to be somewhat tight, but as things opened up, the necessity of having it being tight seemed to dissipate, tight-knit group. But at Morton was a source not only of health care and the clinic itself, but is also a source of jobs. The Tulsa Community Action Agency was a source of decent-paying jobs, which was a great interest of mine. So at that time, in my opinion, back in the 70s, the Tulsa Community Action Agency, Morton Health Center, and the private enterprise of American Beauty Products were the major players for job creation within that community. So I jealously looked at this. In comes OU. We're going to put a diagnostic clinic no one understood the concept. I saw it as an attempt to come in and move out the private sector, medical community, to be in competition with the private sector. I saw it treading on the toes of health department, public health department, and the administration there was pretty sensitive to it because there was no collaboration, no conversation going on. And of course, I thought, as I said, it would be injurious to the private sector. So those three entities, the private sector, Boren Health Center, and the Tulsa Health Department, I felt this unannounced mission, not understanding its purpose. But I had, when it came into place, taken them to task editorially. Not only editorially, I had gone to meetings and I pled, look, if you want the community to be healthy, once I understood, you need to create jobs. These jobs are going to be created. You need to get the community to buy into it. You need to let people know that there's an opportunity to work. I mean, you're going to be healthy, give them a job. Not give them a job, but give them an opportunity to have a job. Well, Dr. Clancy, he was all about getting health coverage for otherwise inadequate health delivery system. He's a man of medicine. He's a man of health care. But there's no job creation component. There's no outreach to the schools, either to the junior colleges or the high schools, to say, look, this industry is going to be in your midst. Get ready for it. If you want to live in your community, if you want to work in your community, here's an opportunity. This is what you need to do, learn. No spade work like that was being done. And I've been pleading with him for 2-3 years. I couldn't get their attention. And this is the importance of a paper, having a source of influence. So I write an editorial. It's OU pimping the Tulsa North community, using it for its own personal goals. What an outcry. George Kaiser calls me up, and at that time I'd served on his bank board for 8 years, calls me privately and says, Jim, I really disagree with what you're saying, but I would like to write a response. Promise not to publish it. Yes, sir. So he writes me this long, reasoned position. And one of his colleagues that he consorts with, Steve Mandow, who at this time is heading the Tulsa Community Action Project, calls me up to express his dismay. Dr. Clancy's feelings were hurt because, look, I'm just trying to do good, and you're suggesting this. Well, as it turns out, it hit a sore spot. Boren enters the picture.
David Boren, president of OU.
Right. He enters the picture and wants to have an audience with me. Well, by that time, I'm trying to marshal the people who can help deliver and build a facility. I'm trying to get opportunities for them to bid and to get work and to be trained. This article makes me estranged from Senator McIntyre, makes me estranged from Jabbar. Jabbar was sort of raised up under Boren since he was a student over there.
He's now a legislator, Jabbar.
Shoemate, now seeking the Senate spot that Senator McIntyre is vacating.
So you're getting to feel like the lone wolf here on this thing?
Well, not really, because, I'm not even thinking that, but these people were associates of mine, and Judy was a very close friend of my baby sister. They were very tight, and of course my baby sister is deceased, but I knew her as a child. But I knew what I was speaking of, which knew was hearing me. Look, you're talking about health? Let's get jobs and get an opportunity for jobs. Sign of a healthy community, people working. Well, in comes Boren. Boren convenes. Interesting enough, they select Jabbar to sort of head this. But around the table were people who can otherwise deliver services. Boren comes in, much to his credit, and says, look, no quotas here. I want optimal use of people indigenous to the area to have an opportunity. I'm not looking for quotas. The sky's the limit. I want it done. I was not invited to that meeting, but I went anyway because Judy and Jabbar thought I'm a troublemaker, I guess, and sowing seeds of negativism. They didn't include me, so I go. Now, what predates this, there was another meeting in which I sat on the sidelines, and I was invited to be a part of the table discussion. I declined. And this time, they invited me. I declined. So throughout the discussion, Jabbar, who's chairing it, really doesn't want to acknowledge me. But Boren's got his eye on me. I'm on that side. And if I don't want to hear what Goodwin has to say, and of course I give my 2 cents, but I'm pushing them to create an environment for people to earn a living. Because you got a $20 million facility that's coming up. There's going to be a need for work in that area. Plus, look at the small business development that can develop in and around it. I'm for creating a healthy community, but nobody's doing anything about it. Well, they tell me that the percentage is up around 20% is what they're using in terms of minority employment. And word, by the way, I don't like the use of the word minority, but for this discussion. So they're up around 20%. I don't know what the current numbers are, but we did make some inroads. One guy told me several months ago he got a $250,000 bid that was accepted for doing something, I don't remember what, which all was a sign. Now, keep in mind now, Health Department is building another $10 million facility about a mile and a half away. So we're looking at maybe a health core with Morton Health Center employing people. They have a great director over there, Mr. Stover. So you got a health core industry in an area where there can be jobs that are created. Keeping in mind now, Morton had a substantial employment of African Americans. Tulsa Community Action Agency had a substantial number. Now, one of the reasons I think I'm fixed on this is my college thesis was how to create a better work environment for people who lived in the Tulsa community. That's my thesis. I go through a analysis of the workforce. I grew up, most of the people, other than the school teachers and the doctors and the lawyers and bus drivers and the Wall Street merchants, the rest of the community were servants. You know, they're busting dishes or they're waiting tables and that kind of thing. And so I had this great desire that was really spearheaded by the Urban League to try to create and get into the mainstream of American life. Now, I'm coming out of a middle-income environment. This business of moving on up was a part of my training and upbringing and experience. So I'm still trying to do that with respect to the Tulsa North community now. And there's some modicum of success, not what I'd like, but certainly. And so Dr. Clancy says that he's used this experience and taken a Caliban tour, and he says he lectures on the importance of including in planning people who are going to be affected by it. But pure health is going to have to be with people working if you're going to have a healthy community, and that should be a part of their planning. So that's an example of where the press, that editorial, had a positive long-term advantage, and there have been others.
Here we are in March of 2012. That building hasn't been built yet, that facility, the OU facility?
Well, yes, it is being built. It's
in the process of being built. Right. And you feel much better now about how they're going to be employed?
Well, there's some effort now to include, and I haven't monitored the progress, but there is a person they've designated to monitor the progress. And I'm just, I have other things to say grace over, and so I've really not paid that much attention. I just get a report from time to time.
But all your years of service, probably 40 years at this point, to the Tulsa Health Department,
yes,
there is the James O. Goodwin Health Center.
Yes.
That's named in honor of your service and work for the community in the area of health. You ought to feel good about that.
I do. I remember Dr. Burnage, who was the board chair at the time, I think may have spearheaded the naming of that facility. I've always tried to not be ungrateful, but never did I think that that makes me something special, other than the fact that the recognition is something that, as a kid, I probably would have relished. As a senior person now, it's not that important, and yet I don't want to be an ingrate or ungrateful for the recognition. I remember when they bestowed that honor on me, Dr. Burnage said, "Jim, for somebody who doesn't like recognition, you seem to be enjoying it." My mom was there, I remember, and some of my children.
Let me just throw out some names that I took notes on when I spoke to you a while ago and what they mean to you. John Hope Franklin.
Dr. Franklin, I knew as a kid, particularly when I was in high school. His nephew and I were very close, Waldo Jones II, whose dad was a lawyer. His mom, Moselle Jones, was a teacher. As a kid, he and I became fast friends at Carver Junior High School. In fact, we competed against one another for the student body election. I was fortunate enough to be successful. There were two people who were my campaign managers in that venture. One was the mother of Mundy.
Kenny Mundy.
Kenny Mundy, who was renowned for his...
he won silver and gold medals at the Olympics.
Right.
For
his mother was my campaign manager, Elizabeth Mundy, or Presley at that time. And another was Pat Tater, who later married a baseball player out of Chicago, whose married name I cannot now remember. But there was a very lively campaign. That's why I think politics was in my blood. As I said, I was a popular kid back then, too. And Waldo raised a great campaign. I remember on the eve of the election, his dad or someone had arranged to show a movie in the assembly hall of the school, which would have made him immensely popular, showing a movie to the kids. Not to be outdone, I run to my dad and tell him this development. And he and Amos Hall gathered up money for me to go buy trinkets. And so as people were going into the movie, I'm handing trinkets. How my people are. And we had the purple ticket and the white ticket. Those were kind of memorable years, but Waldo and I were very close. Of course, Dr. Franklin knew my mom and dad and my aunt. And as a result, I then would be listening to him. He was a man who spoke almost like an English gentleman. And, of course, in my later years, would visit with him from time to time about his work. But, as I said, they were personal friends of the family, so I got to know him from that perspective. Mm-hmm. And the immense contributions he made to history, in retrospect, were enormous.
For some reason, I took notes like Muhammad Ali. Did you have relations with him?
Only that he'd visited, again, the newspaper, and so I've met him on 2 or 3 occasions. He'd come to my office on a couple of occasions. But this was after his renownedness as a boxer in his later years. In fact, he was in the stages of the disorder that he has currently. But he, a man of immense wit, immense sense of humor. But I would visit with him, yes. From time to time, there were other people. I knew the football player, Greer, who was a close friend and a bodyguard for Jacqueline Kennedy, Rosie Greer. I remember him coming, and other people from time to time.
Names like Joe Louis, what does that mean?
Joe Louis, I had the privilege of interviewing. He was in Tulsa, not boxing. He may have been in the wrestling arena at the time, a referee. But I would sit at his bedside, as I did with Satchel Paige, as a young writer, interviewing them and writing stories about them that appeared in the paper somewhere. And I may have been either high school or college, I can't remember which, when I had those opportunities. Joe Louis particularly was an unassuming individual. You know, at that time he was not the same great bomber, but I can remember as a kid now, I had to be 2, 3, 4 years old, listening to the fights of Billy Conn and Joe Louis. Every American would have their ear by the radio. This predated TV. He was a hope. And you know, it's interesting, not having experienced segregation at that time, I can remember the immense pride that surrounded my family about the great bomber, the brown bomber. And I remember going to movies and there would be advertisements with a punch that Joe Louis promoted. There was a punch and there was a drink, soft drink, that had the Joe Louis on it. Jersey Joe Walcott, Jesse Owens, Jackie Robinson, the great opera singer, Mary McLeod Bethune, who sang in Washington, D.C., Marian Anderson. These were people who lived in my lifetime that were celebrated within the black community. So I do remember distinctly that these people set the bar.
It's interesting how we talked about Thurgood Marshall and Martin Luther King, but the third assault on racism turned out to be sports. And when you talk about Joe Louis, his defeat of the German Max Schmeling in 1938 was just huge.
Right.
And then you talked about Jesse Owens, whose 4 gold medals in the 36 Olympics discredited Hitler's racist ideology,
right.
That it was sports, too, that
right.
had this assault on racism.
You know, it's the interesting thing about human beings. I mean, we make all these distinctions amongst ourselves, and we go through generations with these myopic beliefs about human beings because of different colors, different cultures. It just seems like it's a monumental waste of energy to have to plow through these pride and prejudices of people. To me, it's amazing. Maybe it's because of my birth and because of the difference in color around me. But I've had Indians, and I got a Pakistani woman working for me now. I've had Indians and whites working for me for years. My dad, even back in the days of segregation, had whites working for him, linotype operators. Back then, this is the days of segregation.
Today you're practicing law, but you challenged successfully before the U.S. Supreme Court and the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals the constitutionality of the state statute and city ordinance regarding freedom of speech.
Right. Yeah, rather dubious distinctions. Being a Notre Dame graduate, the MF word was used at a chapel by a self-styled Black Panther back in the 60s. And one of the police officers present took an exception to the fact that he referred to them as MF racist big cops. and had him arrested. And he was facing 30 days in jail, $500 fine. And I was in my sickbed in the hospital at the time when I was first introduced to Eldridge Cleaver's book, Soul on Ice. Don Ross, a former state representative, brought me the book.
Say the book again.
Soul on Ice, written by Eldridge Cleaver,
okay,
who was a Panther. But that had an indelible impact. It was so well written and moving book. I grew this beard as a result of the impact it had on me. Shortly thereafter, this man was arrested, and it was so obvious that it was a political arrest, if you will. Obscenity has three elements as defined by the U.S. Supreme Court, one of which it must appeal to purity and interest. It must be patently offensive. And three, it must have no redeeming social value. Well, you would not have to be Ned the First reader if you call somebody an MF that's going to appeal to pure interest. I mean, that's going to insult. That does not excite thoughts of lust. It excites thoughts of contempt and anger. I mean, that was obvious. And for them to put him through this ordeal, I couldn't countenance. And so somehow it falls in my lap. Interesting enough, you asked me if I was in a demonstration. Don Ross was to raise money to assist on this kid's defense. He was able to raise money. He says the other day it was $1,500. I only remember $5, I told him. But before he delivered that money to me, he insisted I walk from Tulsa University to downtown City Hall during a Vietnam War moratorium. And of course, King was against the Vietnam War. In that march was Penny Williams, former state senator, and the corporation commissioner, who's now practicing law, whose name escapes me in a moment, to come to me here in a minute. Patty Eaton, I think, may have been the wife of the president of one of the banks.
Leonard Eaton?
Leonard Eaton's wife, and I think Mary Athens, I think was the name of hers. These were women, wives of people of note within the Tulsa community. One other person who was Wadi Commissioner, too, at one time.
They were all marching in the anti-Vietnam War.
They were really outspoken at that time. But socialites. Anyway, I walked before he gave me my $500. And I didn't walk willingly, but the dollar was my incentive.
But it helped pay your expenses
yeah,
to defend this man.
Yeah, so we went to trial in that case. I first convened a federal court to enjoin the prosecution unsuccessfully in federal court. I appealed that decision, and only two justices, Brennan and one other, sided with me. But the court said, I'm premature, go try your case. So I went to try the case. Judge McDougall was the judge. Jack Morgan, who was a classmate of mine in law school, was the prosecutor. I grew the beard, and I wore dark glasses. I remember later a federal prosecutor who was black thought I was nuts. He said, Jim, you ought to cut off your beard. Ed Parks, who was a former Supreme Court appeals justice, was practicing law at the time. Ed Parks came to my dad. Ed, what's the matter with your son, Jim? All thought I was radical, and I wasn't. But I grew it for effect, And I remember trying that case for 2 weeks over those 3 words.
And this year would have been?
1969.
Okay. And so went on for 2 weeks?
We picked a 6-man jury. And I brought in a professor from TU to talk about subcultures and about language. And I took the unabridged dictionary and I read from it. The judge turned red, the prosecutor turned red as I read the words that would otherwise be considered vulgar. I would read them right out of the dictionary. The judge sat me down after I got through Pussy Willow. I think it was one of the words I used. I should have would was another. And I'm just rattling off, We tried this case. Jack wants to make me a Black Panther. I mean, that is a mentality. Of course, I had to look, I tell the jury, don't spend any time making a decision in this case. Get in there, make your decision. And they did. They came out about 5 minutes with a guilty verdict. Less than 15, I think. I then appealed that matter to the Court of Criminal Appeals. And the Court of Criminal Appeals says that word is obscene. So then we take it to the Supreme Court, red certiorari. But one of my strong allies by this time was working for the Justice Department in the Civil Rights Division. Jay Mulkeen was his name, who was working for Mitchell, who was Attorney General. Sub Rosa, he flies into Tulsa to assist me in the preparation of my red certiorari. At that time, I have a young associate working for me, Brenda Robinson, who knew Thurgood Marshall quite well and who had come from the NAACP Legal Defense Fund to my office to work. Well, we get a mandate from the Court of Criminal Appeals in Oklahoma, Court of Criminal Appeals, saying he must report to jail immediately. Wouldn't set bond, nothing for me to appeal. We work around the clock. I put Brenda on the plane on Monday morning or Sunday night. She's in the U.S. Supreme Court clerk's office. Rodak was the clerk at the time. At that time, the underground weathermen were around, and so they had metal detectors back then because of the antics of the weathermen. She gets into the clerk's office and pleads, it's a matter of life and death. Of course, that's an exaggeration, engaging in hyperbole. She says that Rodak, beneath his glasses, looks over at her and says, and they die, don't they? Not to be outdone, she goes out, gets on the payphone, and calls Boren, who is the Supreme Court Justice assigned to this region. There are 9 regions. And tell us what her plight is. It just so happens there are 2 other cases pending with the same issue in 2 different other jurisdictions. So when she explains this, they said, come right in. So they usher her into the justice's office. They look at it. They pick the phone up and call Oklahoma, let him out till you hear from us. He's released. That is a testimony to how our system can work. This is a misdemeanor. $5 fine, 30 days. The man could have served his 30 days in probably 15, given credit. He did serve the weekend in jail. To me, though, I just marvel at the system that worked in that instance, how marvelous the system was. By the way, when he was convicted, big blazing World War II headlines, Panther convicted. When it came out 2 years and it was stricken as being unconstitutional, I get a little squib in the paper, relegated to the back pages, which of course didn't make any difference to me. But I marvel when the system worked. And of course echoes the sentiments of Thurgood Marshall in stark contrast to the nonviolent efforts of Dr. King that he got from Gandhi, and perhaps before that, Thoreau. I think they came to appreciate one another during their lifetime. Thurgood believed in the rule of law. King did too. But King's view was, we violate the law, we pay the price. And that's what he taught his followers. Yes, this is against the law. This is an unjust law. Be prepared to go to jail. But the soul force behind it revolutionized our nation and the world. And I think it stands as a symbol of what can be done when people do galvanize. And Dr. King was a force. You know, you can hear him say, I've been to the mountaintop. Even on the eve of his death, he's announcing this. I've seen the promised land. I mean, I'd get there with you.
So, in reflection in Tulsa, race relations today, 2012.
We're still relegated to the biases and prejudices of yesteryear. I mean, there's no question about it. My son, he's writing about the fact that McLean High School is going to be taken over by the state because of its poor performance. Education today, I mean, Dr. King, be rolling over in his grave now if he saw how the kids, I mean, there's a civil rights that has to be conducted, not so much directly against the white community's transgressions, but within the black community, the gang activity, the anti-education attitude among some people. You hear sentiments being expressed. Now, I'm not wanting to paint this with a broad brush, but there's a strain within the black community, it seems, when you're trying to get an education, you're actually white. I mean, that's anathema. It doesn't make sense. And you have kids whose uniforms now, whose dress are patterned after people in prison. Those little hanging pants, that's a prison dress. So you're emulating all these negatives. Of course, generally speaking, in our society, the family unit is dysfunctional, it seems. You know, you don't have the clue. That's a broad brush. But there's a lot of work that needs to be done within the black community. The faith community within the black community hasn't stemmed the tide particularly. You do have pockets where self-improvement is preached, but not, it seems, like it was when we were faced with the outer enemy of segregation, where education was the key to a better life. Booker T. Washington was misunderstood, in stark contrast to Frederick Douglass, when he said, lift others as you climb. Those who did not understand what his goal was felt that he was surrendering, if you will, to the attitude of inferiority. Because when you're lifting somebody as you climb, although it's nobly expressed, the idea is that you are from an inferior position. Frederick Douglass says, look, I don't want to be moving vertically. My progress is horizontal. Put me on the line, I'll give the next person, unchain me, a race for his money. I will compete. That was Frederick Douglass's view. So that the progress of humanity is on a horizontal line, and Booker T. Washington is on a vertical line. Well, the truth of the matter is, our progress as human beings is the hypotenuse, if you will, of the right triangle. We go upward and we go outward in terms of our development as human beings. But both those men articulated a view of progress. Today, we are as American as apple pie. I mean, black folks are. And yet, there is a disconnect within the black community that's not wholesome. You know, when you have the gang shootings, I mean, we were decrying lynchings when I was a kid, but you have that same kind of thing going on now. I personally have in a group, a men's group that I have now, I had a kid many years ago, came to my office. He was probably 21 years old. He came, he said, under the influence. Why he came, I do not know. But I was struck by him, and I encouraged him to write a letter. He did, which I published, which seemed to be instrumental in making him look at life a little differently. But in that letter, he said, being a member of the gang, there are only two things. You'll either end up in prison or you'll end up dead, age 21. He is not thinking that he would live beyond 21 years old. He had been shot 5 times between the ages of teenage years and 21 years old. Today, his life has changed, and all that's behind him. But you have that mentality out there. To me, it's inconceivable that a young man could think that he could not live beyond 21. I mean, the aspirations of his life. He's in his 40s now. You have generations out there that seem to be lost. How they're reached, who knows how it's done. I think back in the days when Plato decried youth and how miscreant they were, misbehaving. So I don't know whether that mentality is a human being thing that happens with each generation or what. But I do know that much work needs to be done in human development within the black community to get it where it ought to be and where King aspired for it to be and when Frederick Douglass aspired and Booker T. Washington aspired and Thurgood Marshall and all those other people have aspired us to be. There's a lot to be done, and you cannot blame it on racism. That's for sure. You cannot blame it on that. We talk about that even in our paper from time to time. I mean, these people who start off their lives with this sense of, I don't know how to describe it, eventually some of them get turned around, and some of them reach back to help others. But still, we are plagued with this senseless killing in our community. You know, it's in stark contrast to that great outcry that's happening now with this kid that was killed.
Trayvon Martin in Florida.
Yeah.
He was shot by a so-called community watchdog person. So the big argument in America today, and with marches too, as a matter of fact, that he was targeted because he was black, right. And that's why the man shot him.
Right. And you have blacks killing blacks now, you know, routinely throughout America, which is a phenomenon that certainly in Dr. King's day didn't exist. Or if it did, it certainly was not written about, and I think it was probably rare. You wonder what's going on in our society that allows for that kind of thing to flourish. But there's much work to be done.
So while we were able to come up with civil rights, that might have been an easier thing than to correct what you're just now talking about, in some respects.
In some respects, I think so. I think there's going to be leadership that has to be, you would think, just as the civil rights was turned around because of moral force, you would think that that would emanate from the black church itself. Not so. Now, there are some ministries that are built on turning around. The Muslims are noted for taking people from the dredges of society. There are some Protestant faiths within the community that are taking people who have been hopeless and brought hope to them through the ministry of Christ. But there's still a prevalent view, though, I might add, among some people that regard ministers, and I won't just say black ministers, but I remember a community activist who's now deceased referred to them as ecclesiastical pimps, people who trade on the name of Christ and live large lives as a result. There are those that are there that many people have a disdain for and therefore turn their backs on. And I don't know whether that is a thing that keeps people away. It just may be a generational thing when people, as they grow in experience, they recognize that those things that they saw when they were young are no longer important.
Yeah.
I don't know the answer to that.
You know, you've done so many great things. You're still young, 72. You have many more years to accomplish things, but great things in our community. Do you ever think about the fact that, as I look at your missing arm and that accident that you described earlier, your life could easily have been taken at that time? There was no question about that you were allowed to live to accomplish what you've done, and you must be grateful about that.
I'm certainly grateful. My mom, again, one of those principles, God saved her life for a purpose. I must tell you, sometimes I still try to ferret out what that purpose is. You know, purpose is very definitive in the life of King, in the life of Winston Churchill. These are men that come to my mind, the life of Christ. These people, during their lifetime, came to grips with their purpose. Churchill turned to his wife, Clemmy, on the eve of his ascendancy to the prime ministership. The backdrop of his father reportedly didn't think he'd be worth 2 cents. But he turns to Clemmy and he says, Clemmy, for this moment, I was born. Now, this portly guy rallies our nation against a terrible enemy, Nazi Germany. For this moment, I was born to recognize that. Dr. King, I've been to the mountain. I've seen the promised land. I may not live to get there, but I'm ready. You know, I've achieved my purpose. Christ saying, my hour has not yet come. Recognizing the purpose for which he was born. I must tell you that I don't have such a single revelation in my own life. I'm glad to be alive, and my life has been one that I thrive on being able to be of service to other people. That to me is important. It doesn't yield dollars, necessarily, but it gives me a satisfaction. Again, these are perhaps moral judgments. You have to be somewhat leery sometimes of trying to make moral judgments. Therefore, I'm very cautious about it, but somehow people can feel so right about things, be so wrong, One of the greatest conversations, I think, in the history of man is the conversation that Christ has with Peter. Christ says to Peter, who do men say that I am? Peter, not liking to be wrong, says, well, some say that you're Isaiah, some say that you're John the Baptist, some say you're a great prophet. He thought he'd cover the waterfront. Christ says, well, who do you say that I am? He says, well, you're the Son of the living God. Well, even in that moment, he really didn't know who Christ was, because moments thereafter, Christ says to him, puts it to the test, in a few days I'm going to die. And of course, Peter said, no, I won't let that happen. I'm paraphrasing. And the moment he says that, Christ says, get behind me, Satan. Just a moment ago you said, upon this rock I'm going to build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Now you're calling me Satan? I mean, come on, give me a break here. Well, at that moment, Peter did not know Christ's purpose. Because Christ is saying, look, and I'm paraphrasing all of this, you got your priorities mixed up. You're thinking that you can get me out of this dilemma, this test I'm going to go through. If I don't die, you can't live. You're stopping my purpose. You're stopping my purpose. And then, of course, Peter says, well, what am I supposed to do? He said, stop relying on yourself. Deny yourself. You pick up your cross, whatever it is, whatever adversity you have, and you follow me. And in a sense, that sense of purpose, these examples I've given you, I even now don't know. At age 72, don't know. I just know that I've got a tool to live with, to earn a living by, the paper and my practice. And I try to extend my talents, what I do have, in ridding what I consider to be wrongs. Sometimes successful, sometimes unsuccessful, and always with a sense of, but by the grace of God who I, My wife used to say, the world will no longer remember whether you do or die. Dick Hughes, who passed away a few years ago, who was a young man, he and his brother, both of them now deceased, owned Pepsi-Cola bottling company. As a young man, was advisor to 4 presidents. He said to us in this group, you measure a man's success by the impact he's had on his peers, on his children, and his grandchildren. That's about the measurement you can give to anyone's life. That's, to his way of thinking, a success. And he was a man who, in a sense, had great successes. And yet he also was penniless and then came back, would tell us, quote Job, even though you slay me, I would trust in thee. I mean, that was kind of an attitude. And that overall is the kind of thing, tattered though I am, you know. I was talking this morning with a group. You cannot earn your way to heaven. That's a gift of God. That's grace. But I made the comment, I said, well, you can sure earn your way to hell. You know, your acts may not get you to heaven, but your acts can sure get you to hell. I said, that's a kind of an anomaly here. Supposedly your deeds don't give you merit to salvation, but you sure can get on this bad side.
Right.
That's what you do.
Well, you're living your purpose, and there's no question about the moral compass you were given years ago is helping you in the areas of law and newspaper and righting wrongs. And I want to thank you so much for what you've taught us here today. Yes, taught us. And for those younger generations who will be coming on to listen to this now, they will draw many things from your words, and I appreciate it very much.
Thank you for the opportunity.